everyone, and welcome to Creative Retreat Live. My name is Maxi and I'm a calligrapher based in Vancouver, Canada. Today's lesson is called Constructing Consistency in Your Calligraphy. It's applicable to traditional scripts like engrosser script and copperplate. When we talk about consistency, we usually think about the uniformity and regularity of our strokes. For today's lesson, I want that description to also include that we are being consistent with our personal choice and personal preferences. Having consistent calligraphy will elevate your script to have a more polished and refined look. Apart from that, being consistent in your choices will help you discover and develop your own style.
These are the materials that we will need for today. You can use either a straight or an oblique pen holder. Take out your favorite nib and your favorite calligraphy ink. I've also provided a guide sheet for you to use. This is 8mm with 55 degrees slant, but you can use any guide sheets that you have handy. I also have a jar of water and a piece of paper towel to clean our nibs, and a pencil. Before we start writing, I wanted us to study these two specimens I have here of the word harmony. I think it's important for us to train our eyes along with our hands. We'll try to identify what looks off, especially in the first specimen, and you can refer to the PDF handout as well. I chose the word harmony because I think it lines up pretty well with the overall look that I want to achieve with our script, which is to have that balance, coherence, symmetry, and unity in our script. These two samples were written on paper with ink, and I've just imported them into Procreate so we can easily evaluate them together. Take note too that we are reviewing these two samples in the traditional script setting. I like the distinct difference between the shade and the hairline. There is a definite contrast between the two of them. The letter forms are mostly correct. If there's something that I want to adjust here in terms of letter forms, that will be the letter A, and make sure that that oval is the same height as the stem. One of the most striking differences here is the length of the H versus the Y. The Y extends 3 spaces tall, while the H doesn't quite reach that height. Since we are evaluating it as a word and not within a piece, we can say that this is definitely a room for improvement, because if, for example, this was in a piece and H was intentionally shortened because it would clash with another letter above it, then it would make sense to shorten the H. Now for the slant, normally when we are writing, whatever slant that you've established on the page with your first downstroke, try to follow it with the rest of your strokes. The guidelines should help you with that. But while looking at the word itself as it is right now, our eyes are automatically drawn to the slant of the Y because it is the longest and boldest. And comparing the slant of the Y with the rest, the most obvious difference is the slant of the H. We'll go over some tips later on how we can maintain our slant. For the bottom here, while the H and the Y are pretty much on the same slant, you'll notice that the loop of the Y curls in or bends in to the inside more than the H does. Now let's look at the heft or the shade thickness. Similar with the slant, whatever thickness that you first do on the page, try to follow that with the rest of your downstrokes. When we're writing, we're not really going to measure each downstroke that you make. It's just something that both your hand and your eye will get used to the more that you do it. We'll go over some pressure exercises in a bit. As for the transition of the shade, apart from the H being shorter than the Y, the H has a bit more hairline at the loop than the Y. For the rest of the short letters, if we compare the compound curve stroke, which is the second part of the H, against the M, the N, and the Y, even though all of them occupy the same height, the shades do not. The effect that that will have on your script is that when you view it from afar, the N will be slightly less legible than the rest. It could be a style for you to keep the shade right in the middle, but once you've made that choice, it would look more pleasing if it's repeated across the same piece. As for the weight distribution, the widest part of our oval shades here, A, R, and O, are a bit different from each other. The A and the O at the top have sort of like a belly that's situated lower than the R. In the second specimen, the shade of the A is a bit evenly spread out, whereas the shade of the R and the O are weighted a bit lower. Another opportunity here for repetition is the blind loop. The thickness and the shape of the blind loop of the R and the O are quite similar to each other, whereas at the top, it was a missed opportunity because the blind loop of the O is a bit too thin compared to the blind loop of the R. Also, there's a tiny bit of an accent shade here on the loop of the Y, which isn't replicated on the H. Now for the oval width. The oval, or the shape of our O, is a keystroke in this traditional script, as it is also in many other scripts. Ideally, whatever shape and width that you have set on the page for the letter H here, it would have been better if it was followed by the rest of the strokes. As for the oval orientation, the R here has a hidden oval, and I've drawn the slant of the oval measuring it from the two farthest ends of the oval. And you'll notice that for the first piece, the oval of the A is a bit more slanted, while the oval of the R and the O are closer to each other. For the second one, A and R are close to each other, while O is a little bit more upright. Now, for the hairline curves themselves, the yellow lines here are a bit on the angular side, while the turquoise ones are more rounded turns. Try to go back to the key oval that you have chosen for the word or the piece and follow the same curvature for your hairlines. For the bottom here, it's mostly pretty rounded, although that connection to the N could be a bit more rounder. A couple more notes here on where the hairline intersects with the shade. They're pretty much mostly in the middle except for the H and the Y, where the hairline on the Y meets the shade pretty high as compared with where the hairline started with the H. Try to aim for symmetry and for repetition, because not only will it look more polished, it will also help you with the spacing. There's this missed opportunity to curve that entry stroke for the H, similar to how the Y was exited from. In comparing the connection of R to M and N to Y, try to aim for that curved hairline to be as similar as possible to each other in terms of curvature and spacing. Okay, let's grab our paper, and instead of putting my paper vertical or perpendicular to the edge, I would turn it to the left. I am right-handed, so if you're left-handed, you might want to experiment turning it the other way. The three things that we want to keep aligned with each other are your natural finger movement, the slit of your nib, and your desired slant. In this case, I'm using 55 degrees. Also, instead of moving your hand from one end of the page to the other, you will find that you have a general comfort zone. For me, it's usually around the middle. Try to stay in that comfort zone and instead move your paper beneath your hand. So let's do some exercises that will build your muscle memory. I'll be using a pencil for the first part, but you can also jump straight to nib and ink. So using two spaces, draw an oval, and what I'll be aiming here is more on the elliptical side, where if you divide it in half lengthwise, the right and the left side are pretty much the same, as well as when you divide it crosswise. So I'm not going to give you a specific measurement for your oval. That's something that I want you to experiment with. Let's fill this first row with ovals. Start with a very narrow oval, and then gradually add width until you reach a circular shape. And while you're doing that, I want you to be mindful of how your hand feels. Does it feel like you're straining? Take note of the oval that looks pleasing to you and feels the most comfortable for your hand. And again, while you're writing, don't forget to just move your paper beneath your hand in order to stay in your comfort zone. So I'm going to choose my key oval around the middle here, because I feel like that's the type of oval that I will be able to replicate or consistently create. I'm just going to go ahead and draw the same oval and keep it as similar as possible to each other. And these ovals are written in counterclockwise motion. We'll do another row clockwise direction. What I do want you to try is to keep the slant, to keep the orientation of your oval as similar as possible to each other. Not like these two ovals wherein the second one is a bit more slanted to the right. And don't be afraid to slow down and remind yourself to keep curving, keep turning as you go along the oval. It's okay to switch around between narrow and wide ovals as long as you keep them consistent in the same piece. You know, sometimes we need to keep them narrow because we are constrained by the space, or sometimes legibility is really important to us, so using a more rounded form would be more beneficial. Next, using the same ovals that we drew, I want you to take your pen and ink and trace the bottom half of those ovals to get your hand used to the motion of the underturn. Don't worry about the shades right now. If you do find that you tend to make a shade because we're going down, because you're putting pressure on the downstroke, tap on your finger, on your forefinger to release some of that pressure. After that, do the overturns, keeping in mind that you are just tracing an oval and you're trying to keep the key oval in mind. Next, let's combine these two strokes, which is a pretty long stroke. You can lift if you need to, but this is the same connecting stroke that we use for connecting N to Y, for example. Spacing wise, that doesn't necessarily need to be two oval widths, but for the purpose of this exercise, I just want you to go through the motion of curving and traversing between two ovals. I also want you to trace a quarter of the oval, which is the bottom right and the top left. These strokes will be used in your exit and entry strokes of your letters. So far, these are the exercises that we've done. We also need to practice the teardrop shape for our looped letters. We'll execute them in one stroke for now, and it's up to you if you prefer a butter knife shape or a more evenly rounded shape on both sides of the teardrop when bisected in half. Try to keep the same features as your key oval, meaning if you had chosen a narrow oval, then your loop or your teardrop shape here would need to have the same proportion and be on the narrow side as well. For this upper loop, try to keep the left side of it as close as possible to the slant. And whatever choice that you make for your upper loop, try to maintain the same size and shape for your lower loops when it's flipped around. When you're doing your lower loop, try to keep the right side this time as close as possible to your main slant. And keep that negative space as close as possible to each other. Before we move on to shades, I want you to also practice creating straight lines, keeping in mind the tips that I mentioned earlier, where you just need to align the slit of your nib as close as possible to your slant lines, as well as your natural finger movement. You could use finger movement, or you could try to keep your fingers as unmoving as possible and instead slide your palm on the paper. For me, it takes longer, but it's more helpful when you're creating longer strokes. Okay, now similar to how we approached your oval, we will take a similar approach to choosing the thickness of your shade. I want you to start creating a thin shade and gradually add more pressure to your nib as you go along the paper. When you're doing calligraphy, ideally the heft and the thickness of your downstrokes is the same across the board, except maybe for accents or blind loops, which could be thinner. Consider too the type of look that you want to achieve. If you're going for a more delicate look, then you might want to opt for thinner shades. But if you want that bold, juicy, in your face shade, which I tend to prefer actually, then go for it, as long as you keep them constant throughout the same piece. I'm just gonna mark my key heft here, and I'll try to keep an eye on it and maintain the same heft across all my other strokes. So once you've chosen your key, try to practice that at the same time maintaining the same slant on your shades. Next, let's do the underturn shade. Try to keep the same heft that you have chosen in the beginning, and if not, you can always still adjust. While you're doing this, get a feel for when you start releasing the pressure in order to get that tapered end. Let's also do the reverse, which is the overturn shade. Try to add your pressure at the same level as you had released it with the underturn shade, but flipped upside down. Now let's do the combination of the two and try to keep the symmetry of it by transitioning your pressure at around the same time. Try to keep your heft even on pretty much the whole thing except for near the ends, and don't be afraid to go slow. As for the oval shade, you can choose to curve it in or not, or you can choose the right to be straight and close to the slant. Experiment where you want the widest point of your shade to be on your oval strokes. Do you want it around the middle or near the bottom? Do you want your shade to be evenly spread out or to obviously have a bulge? Ask yourself, is this replicable? Are you able to repeat the same weight distribution among all your strokes? And then do the same exercise for the reverse. This is the shade that we will use for letters like S, Z, and a version of X. You can decide whether to keep the shade evenly spread or to make them top heavy or bottom heavy. When we have a smaller X height, there's a little bit less leeway for us, so there's more work that you need to do in order to show contrast between your shades and your hairlines. Next, let's do some pressure control exercises which will be useful for your upper and lower loops. Let's use 2 spaces and try different points of transitioning from thin to thick. The amount of shade that you put in your letters will determine the legibility and the overall sort of emotion that your script evokes. If your script has juicier shades, it usually gives me that sense of bold and passion to it. When the shades are more on the lighter side, it's more subtle and gives you a more delicate look. It's all personal preference, and there's always a time and place for each type of style. Let's now put together the hairline exercises and the shade exercises that we've done. And feel free to also experiment still with your oval shape and your heft. Later on, when we rewrite the word harmony, we'll try to stick to the same type of choices that we make on each try. So here, let's start with the underturn. You can lift or not lift at the bottom, it's up to you. Depends on whether you find it more rhythmical not to lift or to lift, and also depends on the result that you get on the page. Does it look a bit more rigid or graceful when you lift or not lift? As long as you are able to keep a consistent look and a symmetrical look with its counterpart, the overturn. So try different choices. Try to make the bottom as rounded as possible for a more upright imaginary oval, and then try a more angular turn for an imaginary oval that's more slanted and narrow. Here, I tried to lift for the first 3 and I didn't lift at the last 3. So once you've experimented with a few different choices, pick one and then try to replicate it on paper and see how you like it. Does this look appeal to you, and is your hand able to replicate it? And what can you do in order to keep these basic strokes as consistent as possible to each other? Do you find that you're able to replicate them when you lift or not? Now on the second row, I'm just gonna write the corresponding overturn for each of these underturns that I've made. And it's also helpful to turn your paper upside down to get that visual of how you made the turns and how you transitioned the pressure off of the nib when you're doing your shades. As you do this exercise, keep asking yourself, what do I like and not like about this? What does my hand tend to do? Which option gives me more consistent results? Am I able to replicate my choices consistently? And what sort of look do I want to achieve? The more that you practice it, the more that you'll be able to answer these questions. And also keep in mind that no two hands are the same. We all hold our pen differently. We all have different eyes. We have different tastes, and we have different standards for beauty. These exercises are meant to help you see, test, and decide for yourself these little elements that you would like to incorporate into your script. So here, I'm just trying out different types of roundedness and different types of execution on my basic strokes. Next is the compound curve, or the double turn, which is the combination of your overturn and your underturn. Keep in mind that since we are doing traditional script, The aim is to get the two halves of this stroke to be as symmetrical as possible to each other. Not only in terms of the shade, but also in terms of the hairline connected to it. If you do a rounded turn on the first half, try to replicate that roundedness in the second half. If you do a more angular turn and a more open turn, try to do the same on the second half. So here I have 3 sets of slightly varying styles. They're all perfectly acceptable basic strokes. I just want you to experiment with which type you lean towards. And again, if you're still undecided about lifting your pen at the top and at the bottom, I encourage you to test it out and see for yourself which type of execution you would prefer to have. Turning your paper upside down is always a good practice to see which areas lack symmetry and which areas you could improve upon. Now for the oval. If you've chosen a wide underturn and a rounded bottom of that underturn, try to keep the same features on your oval. Also play around with where you place your shade. Whether you want it evenly spread out or bottom heavy. It's completely up to you. Here, again, I'm just trying out 3 slightly varied styles of the oval in terms of the narrowness of it. Also, if you want a bottom heavy shade, play around with how that looks with the type of oval that you choose. Once you've identified which oval you prefer, you'll need to do the work and practice it to train that muscle memory. Let's do the same for the reverse oval. But this time, it's okay if we don't complete the whole oval and only imagine this stroke being used for a letter like Z. Experiment on how wide you want that turn to look and what kind of weight distribution you want to apply on your shade. Later on, we'll partner these basic strokes all up when rewriting the word harmony. Last, we'll do the basic stroke for your upper and lower loop. There's a few ways to execute this stroke. I'll show you 3 in this video. First is not lifting and just going for it in one full stroke. Keeping in mind that the stem of the loop is as parallel as possible to your main slant and your loop has a teardrop shape. The second way to execute it is to first do the shade and then do the loop. Try to connect them as seamlessly as possible and see if you get better results with that than creating the full stroke in one motion. The third option that you could do is similar to the second one. Do the shade first and then instead of going up, execute the hairline going down, and you can even add a tiny accent shade over there at the top right as you go down the bend. The accent shade adds a little bit more balance, especially when the shade is lower. If your key oval is on the narrower end, try to reflect the same type of turn on your loop. Be mindful of where you transition the shade from thin to thick and see if that point is replicable for you. Similarly, for the lower loops, you can choose how to execute them in one of these three ways. You can execute it in one motion. You could lift after doing the shade before completing the hairline. And lastly, you could execute the hairline in a downward motion. And even add a little accent on the bend of the loop. When you're adding accents, try not to overdo it. Make sure that the inside and the outside of your curve still preserve that teardrop shape. As you do this, keep an eye on your upper loops and maybe even turn your paper upside down before writing, just to have that visual ingrained in your mind before creating your lower loops. Keep the same size and shape, keep the same transition of shade, and just try to keep these two basic strokes as symmetrical as possible to each other. Now, hopefully, you have some idea of what kind of look that you prefer, what kind of look that you want to achieve, and what kind of look does your hand tend to do on the page. When executing these basic strokes together, always ask yourself, do they all go together? Do they look like family? Try not to mix and match a rounded oval with a narrow underturn, for example. Now I'm just marking the basic strokes that look like they belong to the same family, mainly the rounded turns, something that's a bit in the middle. And the angular turns. We will rewrite the word harmony 3 different ways based on these 3 general choices of the basic strokes. For the first rewrite of harmony, I will be employing a more rounded turn, keeping in mind an oval that is a bit upright and wide. So when I make this turn on the H, I would already have a key oval that would ideally fit at the top of this H. And when I do the second part of H, I'm trying to maintain the same rounded features and the same width as the loop that I have established first on the page. When you're doing the oval of the A, look at how you exited the H and see how rounded you made that turn and try to replicate it in your letter A. For the R, we have a hidden imaginary oval for this type of R. Look at the first shade of your A and try to replicate it with your R. This is the connecting stroke that we practiced earlier. We will squeeze them in a little bit tighter, otherwise the spacing between the two letters would be too wide. All in all, for this first piece, everything is pretty much rounded. So when I'm doing the N, I'm looking over at my M. As I exit the N and connect it to Y, we need to look at the connection we did for R and M and try to replicate the same spacing and the same curvature for that. For the Y, keep an eye on your H. Replicate that same shade turned upside down and the same loop size and shape. For the second rewrite of harmony, let's try a more angular approach on the oval, and we'll execute the loop differently as well. So when I do the compound curve here, my hairline is a bit angled and I am turning right away. Now for the loop, I want it to be thin to reflect how angular I made the H. I added a little accent on that loop. Try to keep those curves as parallel as possible with each other. My turns are tighter. My hairlines are a bit more slanted. I'm trying a lighter shade here. It's not super duper obvious, but it's a tiny bit lighter than the first harmony that we made on the page. Try to replicate that same oval shape with your A and O. And then again, as you get to the Y, take a look at your H and how you executed it. Replicate the same stem, the same loop, and the same angularity of your turn. And since I executed the H in two different strokes and I added an accent shade on the bend, I will try my best to do the same for the Y. I kept the loop short in the beginning. I'll try to keep that loop short over here too. So overall, we've kept the turns pretty consistent on this one. I don't quite like how I made my loops short because it kind of looks like my exit stroke is coming from nowhere, but that's okay. The overall look of the word is angular, lighter shade, more slanted ovals, and narrower letter forms in general. And for the third one, I'm just gonna do sort of like what my go-to is, which is sort of something in the middle between the two, between rounded and the angular kind of look. And again, feel free to experiment with the different elements of your script. Apart from the oval and the heft, you could also experiment with the slant, the shade transition, and your X height, and see how that changes the look of your script. Let's do a quick review of these 3 rewrites of the word harmony. I imported them on Procreate. With each look, let's identify the areas that could be further improved. So for the first one, it's a more rounded turn. I prefer the R to be more upright. It kind of looks off to me. How I executed the connection between the N and the Y, I think, is better than how I did for the R and the M. I can see that the hairline got a little bit flattened around the middle instead of traversing between 2 ovals. The weight distribution of A, R, and O are slightly different from each other, but all in all, I think this first word adhered to the roundedness of the key oval that was first established on the page. For the second look, I don't quite like how I ended the first loop too high above the header line, but because we've already done that on the page, I tried to replicate it and keep consistent with that choice with my Y. All my overturns have the same angularity to it. My ovals look pretty similar to each other. The turns on my loop do harmonize with the angularity of the key oval, and the connection that I made between A to R actually fits better here than it did with the first one. The last, just sort of like the medium style between the rounded and the angular style, this actually shows my personal tendency. I also want you to keep in mind that our aim is not perfection, our aim is consistency. It's okay for your script to look human-made because that's what makes it yours. The point of all these exercises is to find your preference and for you to let it show and shine on the page. I want you to appreciate the beauty of your own style. Make your script your own.
So, there you have it. I just want to remind you that the goal isn't perfection because we are not machines, and that's actually a beautiful thing. The key is consistency for us to unlock the beauty and the harmony of our script. More than that, it opens up the way for us to discover our own personal style. Just because it's a traditional script doesn't mean that our preferences cannot shine through on paper. And as a final word, I just want to say that it's okay to write like yourself. In fact, that's the only way that you should be aiming to write. And you can never do it wrong when you are only trying to be yourself on paper. So once again, my name is Maxi, and thank you for learning with me today in the Creative Retreat Live.